This call is now being recorded.
Great. So I'm going to read from your paper. If you could explain to me what you're meaning here in simple terms.
Sure.
The slave trade changed the historical path of Africa through two interrelated mechanisms: weakened institutions and social capital elements such as ethnic fractionalization and mistrust. The established link between these two mechanisms in African conflict and development makes it likely that the slave trade also altered the organization and structure of firms. So how does that all affect how firms are structured, with their ownership?
Sure. Yeah. So we've known for a long time, and some of these papers, of course, have come out in academy journals. We've known for a long time that, the business environment is, heavily shaped by institutions. I mean, if you go all the way back to, to Doug North and his Nobel Prize, it's the idea that basically institutions, and by institutions we mean, government and broadly culture, that those really shape the business environment, that they set the rules of the game under which businesses compete and develop and create value. And so there's lots of research that basically correlates, strong institutions such as property rights or, investor protections or rule of law with basically economic development, and also with, sort of certain types of business structures. And we also, have a lot of evidence that correlates cultural elements like social capital and very closely related trust with business outcomes. But, these are always correlational, and you always worry about when two things are associated with one another, what's really driving this? Where's this coming from? And typically
you were very clear about that causality, this isn't claiming, direct causality. You were very clear about that in the paper.
Yeah, we're clear about that, but I think, we have a lot better causality than the vast majority of papers out there in existence, and I'll tell you why. So, we're not going to definitively claim causality, but, the vast majority of this literature is basically saying, hey, we're going to correlate institutions or culture with business outcomes, period. And I think everyone agrees that that's the case, that, trust is great for development and it's great for firms, and so are strong institutions. So, what this paper is really about is about saying, hey, look, where does this relationship come from? What are the origins of this? Is this something that sort of emerges out of the miasma of history, or can we clearly say that there are definitive events that actually lead to these changes in the business environment that then shape firms? And so what we've done here is we've said, okay, here is the slave trade, which is really one of the most important and significant shocks and events, in human history, but particularly if you look at the history of Africa. And what we say is, look, we know that this depleted institutions, it hurt institutions, it broke down trust and social capital, and we know that those things are really, really important for the structure of firms. That in the absence of institutions, strong government, and social capital, that it's really hard to have well-functioning large firms. So like Tarun Hana's work on this, Mike Hitt's work, we know that very well. And so what we're doing is we're basically saying, what is the origin of that? And we're showing that, in fact, you can trace this origin, back between, basically 300 to 500 years to basically the 18 million people who were taking the slave trade.
Right. Now, you also mentioned the difference between the concentrated ownership and the diffuse ownership is pronounced in the manufacturing sector, where high capital needs can necessitate diffuse ownership when credit markets are weak. Could you explain that?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, part of our whole argument is, and this is something that, obviously I'm going to put in the press release for the inside, but, something we just got in this long running argument with one of the reviewers about, which is that, there are a lot of times where concentrated ownership is good. So, like, there are a lot of successful family-owned firms. But what happens in these types of countries is that firms lose the option to have diversified ownership. And I'll explain to you why this is a problem. So it is a big problem because equity is one of the two big sources of capital if you're developing as a firm. So if you think about yourself as a startup or any other firm, you basically can get capital from, from credit markets, or you can get it from equity markets. And by equity markets, we mean ownership, basically giving up a share of the company. And the problem here is that if you're in an industry or you have a type of business that's incredibly capital intensive, you need to raise a lot of capital. And if you can't get credit, which in Africa is very, very hard to get, like credit is the number 2 obstacle to doing business in Africa, where can you go to get money? And that place you go is to equity markets, where you basically find partners, you give up shares of the company in order to get capital to invest. And manufacturing requires big, big investments. And the problem here, and what this paper is about, is it's basically saying, look, we know you can't get credit very easily in Africa, so you got to go to equity markets. But the problem is you can't even go to equity markets because you have low social capital, so people don't trust, and you have weak property rights and investor protections, so they can't, they can't have any legal recompense, and basically this stuff at least partly originates from the slave trade. And in manufacturing, that's particularly problematic because you just can't get the capital to build factories.
I see. And before we go further, can you give me a couple well-known examples of concentrated ownership firms and diffuse ownership firms?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, if you're talking about, in the United States, like diffuse ownership firms are basically, most large publicly traded companies. And so, if you think like GE or, even Apple, or, Amazon is still pretty, diversified as well. Most of these publicly traded companies have,
Right.
Their shares and ownership are spread a lot. And there are privately owned companies that are also pretty diverse. If you want to think about like really concentrated ownership in big companies, you think of privately held firms and family owned firms, sort of classic ones on this. Like we hear a lot of this debate around CSR these days, but if you take like Chick-fil-A, for example, it's tightly controlled, or In-N-Out Burgers, or basically any family owned business is heavily concentrated.
So give me some pros and cons of the operations of having a concentrated firm.
Yeah, well, I mean, the typical benefit of concentrated ownership that's argued in, the finance and strategy literature is that, concentration basically provides better monitoring because the owners, effectively have a really, really good incentive to monitor what's going on because that's where all their wealth is. And so, that provides a big benefit. And, in family-owned businesses, particularly, you also have these motivational benefits where people, feel a sense of identity with the company. So those are some of the benefits. The challenges with concentrated ownership are generally cost of capital, is a big one. Just that, you aren't raising money from outside, so you have to make sure you're relying on internal cash flow. Or debt, if you can get debt. But again, in Africa, you can't do that. And those are kind of the big ones. There are a bunch of other ones as well. But those are kind of the big ones that are relevant to this paper.
And can you give me some of the benefits and challenges of diffuse ownership?
Yeah.
I'm going over this because I don't want to limit the readers just to people who are understand and are interested in organizational structure, so they'll have a broader appeal. So I'll be defining these terms and everything.
Yeah, so that's kind of what I was talking about before. But the benefit of diffuse ownership is that you can basically take advantage of capital markets and have and have diversified risk. So this is like the the traditional like CapEx models, which are or CapM models, which basically say, look, this is efficiently better cost of capital because with diversified ownership, everybody can own a little bit of every company and not risk losing their entire fortune. So, it just provides big capital investment advantages. And then, the cost of it, again, is like this classic agency issue, which is if you have a bunch of people who own a little bit of every company, then nobody really has an incentive to monitor what a specific company is doing.
Yeah, the company's not their life.
Yeah, the company's not their life, right? And so this is part of the argument around, there are a bunch of arguments around this, but, the problems with having Wall Street no longer be partnerships, and, having them be publicly traded, right? If they're partnerships, then, so like financial services company here in St. Louis, Edward Jones, is a partnership. And every one of those partners watches very, very closely what's going on in the firm because their fortune is tied up in it.
Yeah. You touched on this already, but can you explain a little further? So, say when weak institutions fail to enforce contracts, firm must rely on the social capital of personal relationships for investments. So, you were talking about problems with land ownership and a few other things, but what do you mean by fail to enforce when institutions fail to enforce contracts, specifically in sub-Saharan Africa?
Right. So if you look at India, like India has these huge, like family-owned business groups, right? And again, like I'm relying on a lot of prior work, particularly from Tirana, but you have these institutional voids, and what happens here is that basically, in the U.S. we have pretty strong contract law, which is if my supplier doesn't come through, or I'm a supplier and someone doesn't pay me, then I can take them to court. And the courts will typically enforce those contracts. And so because I have that, if I can get a contract with somebody, I'll do business with them because I know that I have a way of enforcing that. But in places with weaker institutions and weaker property rights and investor protections, if I have a contract where, say, I give you a bunch of money and you give me 25% of the company, if there's no court to enforce that contract, then I get really nervous about that because basically the contract's worthless. And so then what happens is I say, okay, given that the contract's not enforceable, who am I willing to actually do business with? And a lot of that is, who do I trust? And so who do I tend to trust in those cases? I tend to trust family members. I tend to trust members of my own ethnic group. I tend to trust people that I've worked with in a long time. And so in countries with weak institutions, what you see is more, again, family-owned businesses, and you see more like, ethnic-based investing. And that's what we mean by social capital, is this idea of like, who do you know socially that if you go and say, hey, I promise to do something for you if you give me money, that you're actually going to do it.
I see. That's good. And you've already touched on this too, but now it's getting down to how you want to start a manufacturing company. You can't. You said obstacles to diffuse ownership from weak institutions and social capital mean that many high-quality entrepreneurs, managers, and ideas in such companies cannot grow because they lack access to equity funding, leaving expansion and growth to wealthy families and business groups. So anything new, innovative, and starting from grassroots is just choked out. Is that right?
Well, it's not anything, but I mean, look, we're talking about sub-Saharan Africa here, but I mean, look at the United States. What's the number one predictor of entrepreneurship? It's whether or not your parents are wealthy. So, I mean, this applies in a lot of places, which is what we'd ideally want in an economy is we would want the best and the brightest with the best ideas to get sort of efficiently funded based on the potential of those ideas. But instead what happens is, and this particularly happens when you have, like weak property rights and investor protections in places like sub-Saharan Africa, is that there are a ton of really smart people out there with great ideas who just don't know the right people who have the right amount of money, and they can't, write a contract that will convince those people to give them the money, and thus, like, their ideas just don't get exploited. And so, I mean, this is kind of the classic, theoretical exercise, where you say, like, what if somebody is born in a place where they don't have access to, to education and money, and they're the smartest person who's ever existed? Does that potential and intellect go to waste? And I'm not an entrepreneurship person, But, you know, like a lot of the people I know who in management study entrepreneurship, this is one of their big focuses. They're like, look, women and minorities are getting underfunded. They got tons of ideas. They got great, you know, things to generate value, but they just don't get funded because they don't know the right people and, you know, they don't have access to capital. And this is, you know, this is a lot of what this is about is, you know, if you don't have that social capital, then that limits what you can do.
Regarding the data, you mentioned the numbers for the 500 years of the slave trade, 12 million to 18 million. Why is there such a huge disparity in that estimated range?
Well, you know, you're basically estimating those off of old shipping records. So, I mean,
right.
Basically the way to think about it is like if you go back to the 16th century, you know, how precisely do we know the population across an area, you know, and people forget, but, you know, basically the continent of Africa, you can basically put Europe, the United States, China, and India all within it and then have some space left over. And so if you go back that far, it's really hard to understand truly, like, precisely what are the populations. But what a lot of these numbers come out of is they come out of shipping manifests. And so they're looking at sort of historically, what do we know about how many ships were traveling where?
Right.
And what were on those manifests and also overland, and then trying to extrapolate from the ones that survive, project out from that what the total amounts would be. And so, you know, 12 to 18 million, you know, and again, like these numbers come from historians who have, you know, spent their entire lives studying these things. They're pretty generally accepted range. But yeah, I mean, it's, you know, the other number that's in there that's important is just because of the impact of depopulation, you know, there are a number of estimates that say that this basically accounted for reducing Africa's potential population by 50%.
That was the next one I was going to ask you. I hadn't, that, you know, the other numbers I'd seen before, but I hadn't come across that stat. That was amazing, and that exactly, you know, fuels how institutions could be weakened, you know, when half the population is removed.
Yeah, you know, the important thing that we emphasize, and you know, and I think one of the most important things about this paper that we hope, you know, the Academy sees, because again, like, you know, Jerry George emphasized this, but there just aren't many studies in Africa, and I hear so many people, like, for papers like, you know, I heard this with job market candidates too, that where they're like, oh, you know, why should we care about what's going on in Africa or India? Like, how does this generalize? I mean, I used to get this on my papers in China. They'd be like, does this generalize beyond China? And I'd be like, does this generalize beyond 1.4 billion people in the world's largest economy? I think that's a stupid question. So, you know, what we want to emphasize here is that, you know, first, you know, in American history, like in high school, we often don't study Africa, and if we do, we think of it as like some place where nothing happened. And Africa had all these thriving institutions and confederacies and nations, and long histories of institutions. They went back thousands of years, and
yeah,
you know,
I
what
think
happened?
Timbuktu had lights before London did.
Yeah, well, you know, and then like, you know, Kingdom of Ethiopia, but you know, down basically all through Africa, you had all these institutions, and what happened was this really, you know, the depopulation, the lack of trust, the destruction of societies, really, you know, caused, you know, this huge change in the trajectory of the nations and the people who were there. You know, there are 970 ethnic groups. And then on top of it, and this is the thing, right? You know, so the slave trade goes on for like 350 years, and then it starts to peter out, and then the colonists move in. And so it's like, you know, this double whammy. And,
I was going to ask you about that when you mentioned the ethnic groups. So, you know, how European powers, you know, intentionally drew borders to divide ethnic groups. Does that have the same effect? I mean, you can see how that could affect institutions and corruption by setting groups against each other.
Yeah, we cite some papers in there by Mikalopoulos and Papaioannou, who who've done works on precisely this, like these arbitrary border lines. And one thing, we try to be really clear about in the paper is that there's a ton of.
What do you mean arbitrary?
Well, I mean, some of them were intentional, some of them were arbitrary, but they certainly weren't designed around sort of making things, how would I say, cohesive.
Oh, right. Okay. I see what you mean. Yeah.
So your point's a good one. Like some of them were arbitrary, some of them were intentionally divisive. But the key point is a lot of things affected institutions and culture in Africa. What we're showing one of them, and we're showing one of them that can't be explained by all the others. But, we're not claiming that this is more important than colonialism. It's very hard to separate these things. But the slave trade predated colonialism, and that's kind of a crucial factor. And certainly influenced colonialism. And again, Michaelopoulos has papers on that too. So.
One reason I asked you about the disparity in the total number of slaves over that period, for the summary, is it okay to say roughly at 15 million split the difference, or is that problematic?
I think it's fine to do that if you want to say. I think nobody really knows the precise number, so.
Okay, good. Just because that percentage difference from the high-low just in itself raises the question when it stands alone. That's all. And if roughly 50 million is okay, right, it gets rid of that question.
Right, and I think it's, but in the same sense, I mean, I think it's an important point for, for people who read AMJ and sort of are in this world.
I'm not questioning for someone looking.
I'm just saying I think it's an important point for people to understand that studying history is hard, and that and I understand like the perception on this, but 12 to 18 million is it seems like a wide range, and if you're somebody who basically takes CompuStat and writes a bunch of papers by moving the variables around in CompuStat, then that seems very imprecise, but. It's like 12 to 18 million. The whole point of that is not it's 12 to 18 million. Is that it's a whole crap load of
either way, of course. And you didn't even mention. So you were mentioning shipping records. You didn't even mention the illegal ventures that were off the books.
Yeah, well, I would never dive into the fuzzy boundary between legal and illegal during this era. I mean, look, there's no such thing as legal during this era, and so I wouldn't even mention that or touch that, because I think the way I would think of that is just undocumented.
Okay, yeah, I see what you mean.
Because the mafia documents stuff, and then some criminal organizations don't, and. Yeah, I just would never say you just never want to talk about legal when you're talking about something that's awful.
Yeah.
It's sort of like talking about the legality of the Holocaust, right? Because I
was just thinking that those records were very detailed and
also if Hitler passes a law, does that mean we want to call it legal, right? We don't.
Yes, that's a good correction.
I think a lot about these issues about how do you touch these sensitive topics without sort of offending people. So, particularly if you're a white guy.
I've already run into that looking for art to use with the summary. I couldn't find anything that I thought someone wouldn't find offensive in some way. So I'm going to use the two maps side by side. That you have, and then I found something gold coins piled up in the shape of the African continent that I thought isn't quite exactly illustrating the point of this, but I could still use that image with the summary.
Yeah, and what I've typically done in presentations, if I want to have some depiction of the slave trade, what I do is I take historical depictions, like a historical sort of drawing or art that is public domain. And
that's where I went first too, yeah.
Yeah. And then what I do is I basically see who's using this online, which is a good signal of sort of how it's viewed. So like, for example, if Africans or African Americans are using this in blogs or things like that, then I feel generally pretty good about doing it.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's my approach. At any time, basically, I'm developing a presentation about something of which I'm not, whether it's about women or minorities or anything like that. I talk to those people to find out. So
yeah, you have to give that some time though, because did you see? I think it was Barnes and Noble, how they just
oh well, that's
failed.
just idiotic. I mean, that's just like
I don't know how they do their focus groups, but obviously they have to revisit that.
Well, yeah, no, that's just. I mean, that's idiotic. Anybody. I mean, that's just. Yeah. So I don't even think it's that. I think it's just much more about it.
Well, I mean, if it's that big a campaign, they did some research. It's just they failed in how they do their research.
Well, yeah, and the thing I would say as well is, I mean, this is why faculty and experts like me get paid lots of money by companies, is because companies don't generally do a good job of these types of things.
Yeah, clearly. Let's see, I have two last questions. I'm sorry, I'm cognizant of our time. Do you still have time?
No. Yeah, sure.
Okay. So, getting back to causality, let me read from the press release now. Could not definitively, Pierce said he and Snyder could not definitively say the slave trade caused the later concentration of corporate ownership. But like you just said now, no other variable investigated could fully explain the relationship, including weather, colonialism, natural resources such as gold or oil, access to coastlines, or distance to demand markets. And there is some evidence that the relationship is indeed causal. And you, Pierce, talked about the percentage difference. 67% of firms in countries with above median slave imports. So can you explain that to me? How that is it just that percentage is so telling?
Yeah, I mean, so one thing that you want to look at, particularly, so this is what we call a small sample study, in the sense that basically we're using about 40 firms, right? I mean, about 40 countries. And so even though we got lots of firms, we got like 28,000 firms, basically, the treatment variable, they're only like 40 observations. And so because of that, you want to be really careful about just looking at the raw statistics. And the raw statistics basically just say, hey, if you just do a scatter plot, if you just show on one dimension, the number of slaves taken, and on the other, just the percentage of firms that are, sole proprietorships, you see dramatic differences just based on those raw data. And then, this is the challenge with these types of papers, right? Is then what you have to do is you have to spend a ton of time trying to show that those can't be explained by a bunch of other possible or likely alternative explanations. And so much of this paper is basically saying, look, there's a lot going on in Africa. We're going to show you that these two things are correlated. Then we're going to show you that we can't make the correlation go away. And then finally what we're going to do is we're going to use an instrumental variable that is something that we know was a shock to the slave trade specifically. And for us, that was really about, sort of demand markets and business demand market. And then say, if we provide that shock, do the results hold? And they also hold. And so I think the way to think about this is we can't prove causality here. We don't have, the ideal, field experiment, which you'd of course never want on this topic. But, are we 80 to 90% confident this is causal? Yeah. But, are we 95 to 99? I don't think so. That's kind of the way I think about it.
That's very clear. My last question, Lamar, you're talking to a manager or a business leader.
Yep.
Giving them an elevator speech. What's the key takeaway or key takeaways from your article?
Yeah, so this article is a little different from like a lot of the stuff that I do. I can go into a company and say, look, here's what this paper says you should do in this instance. This paper's a little different.
Let me interrupt you right there. So, yes, it doesn't necessarily have to be prescriptive or a practical tip.
Yeah. Yep.
It can be simply knowledge to keep in mind.
Yep, and that's where I'm getting, which is basically this idea that why you should care about this paper. Well, first you should care about it because certainly for Westerners, it's important for us to understand that when we look at the business environment today in Africa or also in a lot of other places, that so much of what we observe is deeply rooted in history. And this is not some function of like bad mismanagement or meritocracy or something like that. But what it also shows, and I think this is really important, is if you look at the trajectory of sub-Saharan Africa, I mean, sub-Saharan Africa, pretty much everything has only been out of colonialism for 65 years. That the trajectory of it is remarkable. And if you look at where those nations are going and the firms inside them, in the time since colonialism and 300 years of slave trade, what it shows is that, this can be overcome. And in the long run, we think that, with sort of big investments in institutions that, we can get better diversified ownership options and thus, better potential for capital.
That's great. Lamar, have you seen any of the brief videos we've made of some of the journal authors, the 1 to 2 minute videos from the annual meeting last year?
No, I looked at the AMD ones that were animated. This is different?
If you go in front of a computer.
Yeah, I'm in front of a computer.
Go to Insights, aom.org/insights.
Okay, insights.aom.org.
AOM.org/insights.
Okay, so let me just go back there. AOM.org/insights. Okay. Okay, I see it. Yep.
Videos, the link to videos on the upper right.
Yeah, okay. There.
Scroll down.
I see. Okay.
And then there's a handful of videos we're doing there. Are you going to be going to the AM in Vancouver?
Yeah, that's the plan. So.
Take a look at these videos and tell me if you'd be interested in doing 1 or even 2 on the insight summaries that we've developed from your research.
Yeah, sure. I'll take a look at them.
And if that's something you'd be interested in, I'll put you on the list. I think you'd do well at that.
Okay. That sounds great. Awesome. Well, thanks for taking the time to do this. I appreciate it.
Hey, thank you for your time and thoughtful responses. Very helpful. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks so much, Mike.
All right. Take care.
Bye. Yeah, no problem. Thanks so much, Mike.
All right. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks so much, Mike.